Welcome back. We're going to do a copy of a study by Joseph-Ferdinand Lancrenon that he completed for this composition for the 1817 Prix de Rome. It's a neoclassical composition, and we're going to be copying the figure on the left, which is this guy. And you can see that Lancrenon dropped this figure pretty much unchanged into the final scene. So we're going to begin by thinking about the size of the head and figuring that this figure's about 8 heads tall. We want to make sure that this is only occupying about 1/8 of our overall height. Note that this is the head all the way down to the chin. And you can just approximate this, but it's good to find the center. We'll take a couple measurements here. Here's the center, and my head's probably a little big. See, we want it to be about 1/8 of that overall height. So I'm going to say it's about 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. So that's about right. Once I get the head locked in and I have the head about the right size, I'm going to measure off of the actual drawing, make sure the center is where I expect it to be, and it is. It's right about here. And this is the greater trochanter of the femur. So I'm going to relate that landmark. Can everybody see that little shaded indentation right here? The trochanter of the femur projects out, and it's the origin of a lot of the muscles of the upper thigh and buttocks, and we can see that that creates a little shaded indentation because all these muscles are diving in to this point. And usually on most people, that is around the middle of the figure. In other words, this distance from here to here is the same as this distance from here to here. And when you're drawing the figure for the first time, it's really important. Just like when you draw heads, you like to know that the eyes are in the middle. It's really important to have some idea of where the center is going to be. And I'm also going to give myself a little plumb line from moving straight up from the trochanter. You see how the trochanter is centered beneath the head. So that landmark should end up being right about here. I'm going to look for the way the neck is supporting the head. We're going to come around and notice that the rib cage in this pose is very much upright. The spine goes to a little bit to the left of the line, the construction line I threw in there, and the rib cage is going to be a mass roughly like this. This guy's quite muscular, so the rib cage is perhaps a little smaller than it appears with all that musculature around it. we usually like to think of the rib cage as really tilting in this pose back towards us, but because he's sort of giving the appearance of lunging forward, the rib cage ends up being very vertical, but the pelvis is tipped strongly forward. So we're going to draw the pelvis as a kind of a box simplification. The common simplification of the pelvis is as a box that's tipped forward like this. With the iliac crest of the pelvis sort of curving up and around the greater trochanter of the femur like that. And the sacral triangle, very clearly marked. We go from the bottom of the triangle is the center of the cleft here, and then it's got these 2 points, and we can see this strong tilt to the left when we look at those 2 little bony landmarks. These 2 points are the back of the iliac spine, which is the bowl of the hip. I'm going to start with this leg because it's supporting more weight. And I want to have an idea, again, where I need to land. So I'm going to pull this plumb line down. And that tells me that the heel should be landing right here under the trochanter. And the lower leg is angled just a few degrees out, a very steep slope. And that should take us to about 2 heads up, which is halfway between here and here. And then the upper leg is a little more of a shallower angle, like that. And this trailing leg, which we can tell by the raised heel, is supporting less weight. The angle of this is about 55 or 60 degrees. And then this knee joint ends up being about the same level as this one. And then this just kicks out a couple degrees shallower, and we end up at this heel, which is a little bit above the level of the other one. So this is meant to look like a kind of a stick figure right now. And that's fine. We're really just looking at angles and distances. This figure has very broad shoulders. So the point of this shoulder, and they're because this is pretty vertical, the points of the shoulders are on pretty much a horizontal. This point is way out here past the rib cage on this side, and this point is way out here. And this arm I'm kind of starting with a little more of a graceful line for that arm. That's how I'm kind of interpreting that gesture. And for this side, we're going to come down to about where the bottom of the rib cage is for the elbow, and then we're going to curve around like that. So we're going to just quickly mass in these forms, and don't try to get the exact contour yet. Just try using, just try like building the forms with a little bit of a scribbly line. It's a good kind of beginner technique because you're not trying to nail down that contour the first time. You're just sort of, it's like we're applying clay to an armature right now. We're just building out these forms and their masses and trying to understand where they're getting thick and where they stay thin. So there's this curve for the rib cage. There's another curve, small curve here for the external oblique. And then the mass of the form on the thigh is going to be in front of the bone out here, although there's also quite a bit behind it. And I feel like the bone is sort of centered on the mass of this thigh because this foot's turned away from us. There's going to be plenty of time to be more precise about these contours, but we just want to start with just an approximation of where the forms are getting thick and thin. And then very important to understand is that on the lower leg, you've got the massive muscle in the back and not too much muscle in the front. So and the last thing we're going to do before we move on to a more precise contour drawing is just start to indicate what's going on with the head, with the hair, the hat, and this profile, which drops down below the neck, kind of like that. So we check our work at this stage with what's called crating or an envelope, and you'll see that in my drawing this angle is a little too shallow, and I feel like the hand is in the right place. So what that tells me is that I overshot this angle a little bit, so I'm just going to pull this back. And you might have made the same error if you're following me closely, or you might see a couple other errors in your drawing, but it's very useful to think about the envelope. See how this connects across here. And this habit is really meant to get you to relate distant forms to each other. Most beginners just relate whatever form is right next to they only relate forms that are adjacent to each other, and most beginners spend less time relating these sorts of forms that are further from each other. So we can see now that this overall shape in my drawing is pretty close to the shape of the envelope of the original. Doesn't mean my drawing's perfect, but there still has some pretty serious errors, but it's good enough to move forward with now. And let me get myself out of the way here a little bit. So after I get this far, I always like to put a portrait on the drawing. So we're going to clean these up and zoom in onto the head. If the features aren't drawn the right scale, it's really hard to get the rest of the proportions correct. So we're going to do the face now. This is what's called a lost profile. My messy works a little bit in my way, so I'm going to lighten that a little bit. We can see the brow ridge and a little indentation for the eye socket. We can see the curve of the cheek coming down to the chin. And then the chin just about disappears behind the trapezius muscle. It's just a very simple line. The eyelashes become very important in this view. They give you a sense of the eye. We can just see a little bit of the nose projecting out and a little tiny bit of the lips. Like that. And the distance between the cheek and the ear is very foreshortened in this view. So the ear ends up being well past the middle of the head. Like that. Some wavy little hairs. And very tricky here, this bulging overlap, these neck muscles, followed by the trapezius bulge, and then the deltoid bulge, which sort of caps the shoulder joint. This little bifurcated forking right there. I think I'm okay with my original sketch of the outline of the hat, so I'm just going to be a little more definite on that contour now. Make sure you have enough of the head to this side of the ear. Notice this is a big space, and there's a few more of these lush curls, these flowing locks. They're just a series of S curves with little random zigs and zags. And this is obviously a right-handed artist, so I'm going to shade backwards and little first shading along this lost profile, and a little first shading on the hat and inside the hair. So over here we have the other side of the neck, and there's that trapezius muscle again that mirrors this one, and about the same level, maybe a hair lower, and then the deltoid again capping this shoulder. And here's that original line that we sketched for the spine. I'm going to make it a little bit of a smoother S-curve. I'm going to erase some of my construction lines. This neoclassical style is full of very elegant simplifications of the figure. It's not really getting carried away with artistic anatomy. It's very simplified and great to learn from for that reason. This is sort of the curve of the rib cage with the latissimus dorsi muscle coming across it, followed by another little curve for the shoulder blade and some of the scapular muscles, but beautifully simplified in a way that you would not find in, say, Michelangelo. And we're going to look for the same forms on the other side. The shoulder blade is defined by this little halftone up here, and then this is the big curve of the rib cage tucking up behind the arm, and this little external oblique, which we already discussed. There's a little plane change indicated here at the bottom of this muscle group. And right at this little indent here, we have the swelling curve of the triceps, and then some narrowing as we get in towards the little condyle of the radius and ulna. And notice that this indent here is lower than this one up here. Usually the indentations do not fall directly opposite each other. And we may as well move down that arm. These are some of the forearm muscles. And notice pretty severe tapering towards the wrist. Little shadow edge. And here's that hand curving around. There's the body of the hand and a few foreshortened fingers, curving around and grasping the woman's hand like so. So there's a very subtle little plane change between this curve and this curve. So don't simplify that into one big curve. There's plane change right about here. It's about level with the top of the cleft, gluteal cleft. It's a polite term for it. And there's that little V-shaped bifurcation at the top, similar to this bifurcation at the crease of the neck. Again, very, very simplified forms. And this fold is much higher than this one. Notice that because of the pose. This thigh needs to be quite a bit wider than I had it, and this thigh is a lot wider too. If you copied like 100 of these, you wouldn't have to think so much about these forms. They would become very natural to you. So we're going to zoom out again and take a look at how the drawing is coming together. I just observed I have a little too much thickness through the trapezius here. It's not unbelievable, but it's also not quite true to the reference. So I'm going to make that a little thinner. And now let's take a look at this other arm. So notice that because this bicep is contracting, it creates a much shorter bulge right here. And the tricep overlaps the rib cage and the latissimus there. Form of the elbow is very pronounced in this pose, and the forearm muscles are bulging again towards the elbow and then tapering to the wrist, just like the branch of a tree. The body of this hand is pretty much foreshortened because it's turning away from us. And the top of the thumb is also foreshortened. So the prominent form here is the muscle of the thumb, which is facing us. And then the body wraps up and around and behind this prop that he's holding, like that. If you have time, go ahead and add some of this background shading, which is obviously just really covering up a correction that the artist made. See how this was thicker before, and it's also sort of emphasizing that contour. And here I'm going to have to make a change and bring this out a little more. But as I was saying before, most important thing to realize is there's a lot of musculature in the front of the thigh, and that's because of the weight of that pose. It's contracting and bunching up. I can see my whole figure is just a little stockier than the original, so I'm going to just trim that back a little. And I also think I came out a little too far in this thigh muscle, so I'm going to trim that back a little too. Here's a great example of that principle of this indent here is way up here, but then this one on the other side is way down here. So do not put them directly across from each other. And this foot is foreshortened right away from us. Here's that heel, very boxy heel, and don't think about feet when you're drawing this. Think about this flat form here and what it resembles. I might think about this form as resembling a Hershey's Kiss. You see that resemblance? And if you think about, if you find an analogy for the flat form and don't think about feet, think about Hershey's Kisses, you'll be more apt to draw that correctly. If you think about feet, you're going to draw what you think feet look like, and you don't really tend to think feet look like that. So. Okay, here's this swelling of the gastroc muscle in the back of the calf, going down to this heel, which we correctly located, centered under the head. And this foot is also foreshortened, but not nearly as much as the other one. So I always tend to make every one I draw a little wider than they are, and then I find myself just having to trim things back at the end. And here's another case where the original artist did the same thing. You see how he put the dark behind the butt here because he moved his contour in a little, and he wanted to cover his tracks slightly, so I'm going to find myself doing the same thing. So my last step is just to go back and adjust my values. Obviously the hair needed to be a little darker, the hat was a little lighter. There aren't any very clear shadow shapes in the flesh. They're pretty subtle, but I'm going back and fine-tuning them. You can see another correction down here where he had the line of the foot way up here, and then he dropped it. I can't tell you how many times I've done that. I realized I need to make my legs a little bit longer than they were. Flattening of this curve right here. It's a little exaggerated. And that'll do it for this copy. Thanks again for watching, and we will see you next time.